So, welcome everyone to our first free panel as part of the Evolving Eros movement group that, has been a new project kind of emerging off the back of the Evolving Eros facilitation online platform and just wanting to really get more into the community and have lots of beautiful conversations that are to do with the sacred sexuality, Neo-Tantra intimacy movement, and to get lots of different perspectives in on topics that are really alive and juicy and important. So we're planning to do different panels and talks every single month on different topics. So yeah, you're in the right place if you love this kind of stuff. And I'm really excited that today we're beginning with a talk on Tantra because this is, been a big conversation with a lot of colleagues of mine and just kind of collectively at the moment because, Neo-Tantra and this sacred sexuality aspect of what people consider to be Tantra has been gaining more and more popularity in the world, more and more time in even mainstream media and in the collective. Now we've got this movement of the word tantra kind of meaning sacred sex or massage or these elements. And at the same time has been the rise in classical tantra having a resurgence and more teachers that are trained in traditional tantra, more and more of the scriptures of tantra coming into translations in English. And then we've got this interesting place where tantra kind of means two different things in the collective, and it's causing quite a bit of confusion, especially when you mix capitalism and needing to promote yourself and use words that people are searching for. So I'm really excited to dive into this topic today because it also touches on topics like cultural appropriation and colonialization and all these elements that we want to be aware of, especially if you are from a white Western background, and recognizing that there are repercussions for the choices that we make and the ways that we promote ourselves. So I have beautiful panel. Some of these folks I know, some of them not yet, and I'm excited to get to know. So I'll just get everyone to introduce themselves. So first, Hema, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Luna. Excited to be here. I'm Hema. I call myself a holistic empowerment mentor. I've also taught both Neo-Tantra and I teach classical Tantra. I led a Tantra community up in Seattle, co-led that for many years. And I teach a lot at festivals. I run my own retreats and workshops and do spiritual mentoring and counseling. So again, excited to be here.
Yep. Pratim?
Hey everyone. My legal name is Pratim, but I also go by Naughty Monkey. And that's a name I took when I started teaching Tantra. I'm based in Austin, Texas, and I was introduced to Tantra, like you said, most of us got introduced through the Neo-Tantra path. And the amazing experiences I had on that made me dive into, like Christopher Wallace and the more classical side of the Tantra. And then diving deep into that and diving deep into Neo Tantra, both has helped me, mix both in ways that I feel that is authentic to the spirit. So I'm excited to talk about this topic.
Thank you. All right, and then we have Ben.
Hello, thanks for having me here. I am a Tantra facilitator and men's coach in Colorado, and I think I have a bit of a weird path, at least as far as white people from the West are concerned, in that I, out of the blue, fell into classical Tantra, having no idea what it was. And for the first 5 years of my work and or my study was entirely classical, and I certainly picked up a pretty strong purist bias, and kind of turned my nose at a lot of the modern stuff and the Tantra stuff, and had lots of arguments with people on the internet about what isn't Tantra. And then I started getting into that world as well, and found myself with like a bit of an inner struggle where the purist was still there, and also I was like, oh, this is actually really, really good, and sexual healing, sexual reclamation, healing of shame is really needed in the world. So now I find myself teaching both pretty evenly, and if there's like one thing that I try to cling to as my true north is to just be really clear in what I'm teaching about what does come from a classical path and what doesn't.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Then we have Harshada.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Luna. Thank you so much for including me in this. I'm Harshada Wagner, based here in Ojai, California. And I am a teacher of applied yoga philosophy, which includes Tantric philosophy, but the background that I come from, and it also includes Vedanta, it also includes Bhakti and yoga philosophy. And as a teacher and facilitator working with people privately and leading trainings, I also have just naturally gravitated towards working with people around their sexuality, working with people around freeing whatever needs to be freed in them. And as we know, a lot of people have a lot of work to do on that aspect of themselves. And I have Jupiter and Scorpio. And so does my partner, Adriana, who's also a teacher. So we tend to be very sex positive, classical yoga teachers. We don't do anything really squarely in the Neo-Tantra world, although she does do more adult sex education. But am very open to it and interested in this conversation for a variety of different reasons. I'm so excited to hear what's going to come up today.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so part of the choosing of people for this panel, obviously you can see we've got everyone's got experience in both Neo-Tantra and like the classical Tantra realm, which I thought was important because I know, we're talking to a lot of Neo-Tantra teachers, and I find that the conversation can be quite aggressive. It's kind of Ben was saying, when you're a purist from the traditional Tantra perspective, there can be a lot of shaming or judgment, and people that actually haven't spent time in the Neo-Tantra world and don't actually know some of the benefits and some of the ways that Neo-Tantra actually can be in alignment. Well, in my perspective anyway, there can definitely be some synergy and harmony around that, but some people can maybe have a bit of a very one-sided perspective. So I wanted to try to give space for both sides here. And also, I wanted to make sure that we have both people from Western background as well as Eastern background, so that we're not just, having a typical conversation of white Westerners trying to give themselves, I'm allowed to do this and call whatever Tantra because I decide so, because that's definitely something that I see happening, that people don't take in the cultural context and background as well. So so I've got a few questions and prompts, and we're also just going to see where this conversation wants to go, and I'm excited for that. First, I want to just kind of go into what is Tantra in your own words, because I find it very interesting seeing when people ask this post in forums and they say, so what exactly is Tantra? And the answers that come up, even from people that are considered to be very well-known Tantra teachers of some sort, I find to be very interesting compared to what I have learned as far as what Tantra is, that, again, comes from studying with people like Christopher Wallace, who's a scholar, as well as Kavitha, who's also, an initiated practitioner, and people that, have a lot of wisdom around this and studying more of the academic side as well as the embodied side. Who wants to start maybe just sharing, like, in your own words, what would you say that Tantra even is?
I would love to kick this conversation off, if that's okay. So I do a lot of teaching on, what is Tantra. I actually even have a workshop that's entitled that. And I too also follow Harish, Christopher Wallace, and others. I've done lots of study in this space. Tantra is a spiritual discipline. So it's a set of practices that are outlined in tantras, which are actually books that outline the spiritual teachings that give you a path to enlightenment. It's as simple as that. So tantra, like mantra, sutra, tantras are actually books, verses that cover teachings around spiritual practices and disciplines. So all of the misuse of the word, like Ben said, I get sometimes a little, not militant, that's the wrong word, but a little strong on that, because it is effectively the way Tantra is being used today is an appropriation of the term, of the word. And it's actually a misuse of the word altogether.
May I share my thoughts on this? So for me, like, Tantra is techniques, and techniques of what? Techniques of recognizing the divine in ourselves and everything else. And so these techniques can be, numerous. And what resonated with people 1,000 years ago in India, the mimetic distance between that and the people in America right now is huge. Like ideas don't just go from that distance. Normally there has to be an overlap for ideas to transfer. And so especially in the non-dual tantra, where everything is a divine expression exploring itself, I find it hard to see anybody's methods as being wrong, because that they are also a divine expression, expressing then exploring reality. And so for me, I feel like even when people misuse it, it is laying the field for future revival of more classical tantra. That's how I see it. Yeah.
Thank you. And I want to throw in as well around, like, kind of definitions of the words. I found this interesting, studying that, a lot of people say, oh, Tantra means to weave. And what Harish was saying at one point is that, in Sanskrit, like in English, how bark can mean the tree bark, or it could be a thing that a dog's doing, that Tantra has a few different definitions, but it depends on the context you're using it. So people often say it means to weave, but that's a different definition of the word Tantra, and that's the definition that's more for what we're doing here is a method or tool of expansion, of expanding the self. And also, that it literally means like a tantra, meaning a scripture. So what is, for something to be a tantric practice would technically mean that it comes from a tantra, like the Vijnana Vaidava Tantra, where you have like 100+ practices that are outlined, being like, okay, do this. This is a technique that will help you recognize your divine nature. And yeah, it's been interesting learning more about all these different tantras, and you have like so many beautiful practices. And then from those practices, because they're often written in a very abstract way, there's so much ways that you can bring in your own style and bring in like other techniques that still keep the essence of that practice, but then bring it into the modern context. So yeah, I just wanted to put in as far as like the technical definition goes. And that's why when people say like, oh, but you know, Tantra is just follow your heart and that's Tantra, it's like, well, not really. That we're talking about a very specific thing, just like, you know, Buddhism's a specific spiritual tradition, and Christianity is a specific tradition. You also have Tantra, which is a specific tradition from a specific place in the world, mostly, you know, India, Nepal, Tibet area. And then that, yeah, follows a specific philosophy and a specific set of practices. So just put that in there. And then Ben, you wanted to share something?
Yeah, one of the first things I always say when trying to answer this question is that it's very hard to do so in less than 8 hours. And the other thing is, like Hema said, it's a system of practices, and even, you know, one of the more correct translations of the word tantra is the system or a system, and books. And it also makes me think, or like even like the way. And it makes me think of like long before Christianity was called Christianity, the people who were practicing it in that first generation simply called it the way. And it has that same kind of vibe to me of like, if I really try to get to the core of what it is, it's a means of getting free. It's a means of waking up. And it is an established, written down, recorded set of practices. But that's kind of like one of the delineating factors I look for, is like, while I could just like make a clean line and be like, this is classical, everything else isn't. The real question for me is this body of work aimed at waking up, at going beyond the small self, realizing yourself as God in embodied form, not in just in a transcendent revelation? And so in that sense, like, here we are, a bunch of modern people with a lot of stuff in our reach, and it's like, sure, do you want to incorporate some viewpoints from Carl Jung? Sure, why not? Do you want to incorporate some of the stuff we've learned from Peter Levine and somatic experiencing? Sure, that's wonderful, but is it in support and aimed at the project of waking up? Because I see a lot of spaces and it's like, oh, this person's doing great work, there's like powerful healing happening here, there's like a lot of stuff going on, and there's nothing here that actually supports someone in the process of awakening. So for me, that's one of the razors I use to divide in the modern landscape what is or isn't in the spirit of Tantra.
Emma, did you unmute because you wanted to share something else on that?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I totally agree with Ben. We've been in similar workshops together, so I figured there'd be, you know, violent agreement with each other. But I also want to say that the book, the tantras and the teachings of Tantra, they're getting mixed up with each other. People are using the word Tantra to represent the teachings of Tantra. So when someone like Pratim says, oh, but you know, but Tantra is everything and everything is Tantra. And so when I start, you know, trying to educate folks, I'll say, but everything's Tantra. No, that's not actually true. Tantric teachings say that there's non-duality and we are all part of the divine. That part is true. So we're getting into like semantics around word use and how words are used in particular sentences. I want to also address the advent of Neo-Tantra. Maybe that might be your next question, but it's a mix of, and Ben kind of touched on this, it's a mix of Western occultism, a bit of modern pop psychology, maybe not even pop psychology, actual psychology, and now we're getting into somatic practices and conscious sexuality and mindfulness that all become this big munge together of Neo-Tantra. And it just feels better, I guess, to say that you're going to a Neo-Tantra or Tantra festival rather than a sex festival. And that's because there's just so much shame in our society around the word sex or sexuality. So what people are doing are hiding behind this like spiritual facade, this spiritual, a friend of mine says, spiritual speckle on the wall to hide what's happening really behind that. And there should be no shame around seeking liberated sexuality. But to Ben's point, Neo-Tantric teachings do not focus on liberation and enlightenment. They just focus on having great sex. There's a big difference between the two tantric paths.
Yeah, and that goes perfectly into what the next topic was going to be. And I know I started in the sex positive scene in Berlin, where like very much I went into just conscious sexuality, and it was much later that my spirituality and I started coming across more of the Neo-Tantra scene. And so I found that was like very kind of healthy for me in a way, but then also there was something a little bit missing because it could be very hedonistic in the sex positive scene. And I hadn't admitted to myself that I was a sensitive being yet, but at my core I've always been a sensitive being. There was a desire and a home that I came to when I got into the Neo-Tantra scene, and there was much more heart, much more slowing down, getting to know each other. It wasn't just about fucking. And I think that's what really draws people as well, because the sex positive scene, I mean, there's a big variety when you're in the sex positive scene. There's like the really kinky and the really, alternative indie queer scene and stuff. But what I really love about the Neo-Tantra scene is that it does really invite in a lot more emotion and a lot more of our full spectrum humanity, which I think is what really draws people to that. But yeah, the question I had was around like what happens when Tantra means two different things globally, where like I know my struggle when I'm coming up with like, okay, should I call this workshop Tantra or not, is it's like, okay, well, if I'm teaching conscious sexuality or conscious intimacy, people are out there searching for Tantra when they're looking for that. So my ideal client that's looking for exactly what I have to offer is out there searching on the internet for a Tantra retreat when I know that, okay, but that's not really actually classical Tantra, or it's not fully, in alignment with the Tantric tradition, but that's what the word that they're using that I need to communicate with them for. So then I get in this bit of a struggle. And I mean, I often then just, maybe in the title I'll say Tantra, and then I'll be very clear, this is Neo-Tantra Sacred Sexuality once I go deeper into it. And that's kind of how I'm trying to reconcile it. But even when I say this isn't a Tantra retreat, this isn't a Tantra workshop, we're doing sacred sexuality, then my students are still telling everyone, oh, at this Tantra retreat I was at the other week, I learned this and this, even if I try to be very clear that like this isn't Tantra, but then, that's what the word means to people. So this is constantly a bit of a struggle of like, okay, meet people where they're at and use the word that they're using and that they understand and what they believe is this. And also because, it markets well. You say like, oh, it's a Tantra workshop and it sells out in 5 seconds. Well, if you call it, attuned somatic conscious intimacy, I mean, depending where you are, but it might not get as many people in because people are like, I want to learn Tantra. I want to go to a Tantra workshop. So I know that's a bit of a struggle I have. So I just want to open up, a bit on this conversation. And for those that are watching, because I see a hand up, feel free to just write into the comments into the chat, or send me a private if you want to come in and ask something. But generally I'm just going to be spitballing here, and then we'll check the chat for extra questions. Okay. All right, so whoever wants to share.
Yeah, I want to just build upon what you said there. I think the word Tantra, like the word yoga, it's just become so misused and misinterpreted. And so I think the wave of the word yoga it's done. It's a completely different thing than what the original texts were about. And it's, you know, yoga is like an aerobics class with a little bit of chanting. And I think Tantra is going kind of the same way. It's being used in a way that it wasn't meant to be used before. And I'm sort of at the point where I kind of throw my hands up, you know, in the air. There's a reason why Modi, the Prime Minister of India, wanted to reclaim yoga and has been making noises about that and has an International Yoga Day, because India and South Asians were trying to reclaim all of this spirituality, all of these techniques that have been appropriated by the West. And it's like, it's kind of trying to claw it back. But it's, I think it's kind of the wave is too strong with respect to yoga. And I think it's the same way with Tantra. So, you know, for the reasons that you said, is it good marketing to use the word Tantra? Is it enticing and titillating to use the word Tantra? Yes, unfortunately. But I love that you use the words more Neo-Tantra. So if we could start making those delineations between Neo-Tantra, classical Tantra, that would go a long way, I think, to clarifying some confusion. But I also want to say, you know, this split into two camps is oversimplifying the field of Tantra considerably. And I had a discussion with my friend Cynthia, who's on here, and there are multiple schools of Tantra. There are multiple disciplines from many different places in India, and like you mentioned also Tibet and other places. So, you know, there's Taoist Tantra, Buddhist Tantra, and even within South Asian, I mean, Hinduism and Tantra, there are many other lineages that follow many different gods and goddesses. So this is the other thing. That's why with Harish, you know, he's very clear. He says Kashmiri Shaivism very clearly, because there are other lineages of Tantra. So it's confusing, right? But I would say to simplify, like let's just use Tantra, and let's use Western Tantra or Neo-Tantra to represent all the other stuff that has to do with sexuality.
So I have a slightly different take on this. I mean, yoga, what has happened with it is that, yes, people took, you know, mostly the physical aspects and have done that. That India was under foreign occupation for about 800 years. And so a lot of these practices were dying out. And got this revival, however imperfect the revival is, it has got attention and resources back into this. And yes, people, you know, maybe a million people will do only the exercise aspect of yoga, but then maybe 10% of them get interested in reading about the other aspects. And that then slowly they think, oh wow, there is all these other aspects. And yeah, I see this as a wave slowly building that had been in decline for 800 years, and in the next 100 years, more and more people will have more nuanced understanding of this, because we now have the internet, we have the books. And so the first people need to have some amazing experience to take interest within these ancient things. And I think that's what Neo-Tantra does. It gives people amazing experiences, and some of them may even touch this divine in themselves during a Neo-Tantra experience. And then they read a book like Tantra Illuminated. They're like, oh, I had that experience. And oh, it makes sense now. And then they dive, but without experience, it is so alien, and it's so out of a person's normal reality of chasing money, status, and all this. And so for me, like these practices that allow experiential I don't know how to say experiential experience. It helps to expand people into learning about the nuances afterwards. So
Yeah. Yeah, you remind me of a meme that I made, which was like, Tantra, come for the epic sex, stay for the awakening into your true nature through non-dual philosophy. Because like that's very much it. You're like, oh, I go to this workshop and I learned this juicy orgasmic wow, and then you're like, wow, Tantra. And then you like peel back under the layer, you're like, whoa, Tantra. Like, and that's, you know, how like a lot of us got hooked like through the peak experiences and through the bliss practices. And then you're like, oh, what is this? Well, you know, when I first was in Nepal and I bought my first Tantra book, it was like a super academic one. I was just like, oh, Tantra, I want to learn what this is. And I just couldn't connect with it at all because it was talking about yantras and mantras and mandalas. And I was just like, I don't know any of this. So once I'd had some more experience, then it was easier to drop into that. So I'll be adding that part. Harshada, I haven't heard much from you yet. Would you like to share a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I try to avoid that definition question as much as possible because it's kind of a mess no matter how you look at it. Once I was in LA and there was this frozen yogurt shop and they had a flavor that was called Tantric vanilla. And I had this very smart ass student who was like now at Harvard, but she just asked the employee, could you just tell me what exactly is tantric about the vanilla in your thing? But I've decided that tantric vanilla is how I describe my sexual orientation. But, you know, like, I think that for me, because I'm teaching yoga philosophy generally, all of my teachers were Indian, and I come from this Maha-yoga tradition that does really weave together all of the different darshanas, the different philosophies. And so when I'm talking about Tantra, I'm usually distinguishing it from the older traditions. So like, here's the Vedantic approach to this particular thing, the Tantric approach to it. And for me, it's definitely like Trika Shaivism is really the Tantra that I'm the most familiar with, as some people have been mentioning. And I'm so glad that you said that, Hema. Yeah, I mean, in India, Tantra means so many things. And it means everything from black magic to, I mean, the last thing that it usually means in India is like Trika philosophy. Like it's a relatively unknown thing there. It oftentimes would mean something more like goddess worship or, you know, like Devi worship, that sort of thing. Anyway, I think that it's important to just say that one of the big vectors in all of this is capitalism and entrepreneurism. And that there's this kind of unfortunate, I'm not going to call it unfortunate. There's a thing where nowadays people can make a living by being an influencer or by being a teacher. And so then they have to come up with what their branding is. And oftentimes that's where these questions come up. Is it Tantra? Is it Neo-Tantra? Is it yoga? Is it mindfulness? Is it, you know, whatever? And here we are. I mean, I think at least all of us on this panel are in that situation. And I just think it's a matter of us just practicing the swadhyaya to really just be as honest as possible, you know, and just admit what we don't know and, you know, just be as transparent as possible that here's what we're doing. Hopefully we're doing something that's helping people. So here's something that I think is going to help you. This is where it comes from. This is what I know about this. And this is my limit. This is my upper limit. Like, go to a more senior teacher than me, or like, here's what I learned from my guru. Try it, you know, and that oftentimes the definitions don't really help that process that much. They help us more, maybe as far as, like you said, like search engine optimization and stuff like that. But like, yeah, and I really appreciate everything that everyone is saying. And Pratim, I really appreciate that perspective that, yeah, there is a lot of, and what Hema was saying, I mean, obviously it's been so watered down and so like westernized and co-opted. And I always say this, it was just like, there's more people practicing all different kinds of yoga and spirituality now than ever in India, and that now I believe in evolution. And I believe that like what we're doing in this moment, however imperfect, is probably taking things forward. And we just have to like hold some responsibility for that we're taking it forward in like the most earnest way that really like that our gurus would approve of and like does justice to the tradition. Maybe I'd say that.
All right, thank you. Was there a little addition, Hema, or can I ask the next question?
I have a little addition. I'm going to respectfully disagree with Harshada, which is that definitions are important. They are really important, because then if you're a seeker, then you need to know what it is exactly, what path you're on. Neo-Tantras have made claims, and I mean, I'm not going to disagree that it's a great gateway drug to actual classical Tantra, and it can open doors for people, but it can also mislead people. Let's look at all of the hashtag #MeToos that have happened with different yoga organizations and different Tantra groups. So definitions do matter. And I don't think that we can just say, oh, this is just leading everybody on a great path. That's a little bypassy to me. I think we need to be very specific about what Tantra is and is not, and what Neo-Tantra is and is not, so that people who are seeking can be on the path that actually takes them to enlightenment. And okay, yeah, you can argue that Neo-Tantra will start people on that path and it's a little circuitous. That's fine, but there's also a lot of harm that's caused in Neo-Tantra worlds. And from my perspective, as practitioners, facilitators, and teachers, we need to be conscious about minimizing harm. So yeah, we need to define things.
100%. I wasn't saying that they don't matter at all. And nor do I agree that like Neo-Tantra is a gateway to deeper work. I wasn't saying any of that. I was saying that within my particular context, I wasn't trying to shit on the process of making those delineations, because I think that they're really, really important. I just thought that was represented pretty well here. So I was just like bringing in another piece.
Yeah, because I think I agree with Hema in that like there's been this whole big born again Christian movement that I think a lot of us have probably seen. And a lot of them are coming out of the Neo-Tantra scene, and they're saying like Tantra is evil and it's shit, and I got traumatized by it and stuff, because they're learning from these very unintegrated people that are saying, oh, this is a Tantra workshop, and people are actually getting put off the spiritual path altogether. And this is an issue I'm having now. Like I'm on Koh Phangan, which is called Tantra Island, and there's a lot of trauma here because this is where Agama was, and there's been a few other predator people on this island, and it's kind of known for that. And now I'm like kind of putting out some like tantric workshops, and people like are really quite traumatized by Tantra here, and they're like, oh, Tantra is a load of shit, it's just a bunch of hedonistic predator people with spiritual clothing. And there's been a lot of damage in the name of Tantra, and then it makes me feel really sad that it's like, wow, people are missing out on this beautiful wisdom that this tradition has to offer, because they unfortunately, got curious and went to a workshop with someone that had no idea what they're talking about. I mean, some of the stuff I've seen, like people Tantra workshop with a yin yang symbol and a shamanic wolf and, all this stuff. And I'm like, that is not at all. And then someone goes there and they're like, this is a load of shit. And then they think, then they just totally dismiss this whole path. So this is where there's like some very real repercussions, as well as like, on TikTok, I'm trying to find like some Tantra people to follow, but then, weeding through the Tantra hashtag, you're like, oh my God, like it's actually really hard to find what I'm looking for when I use the word Tantra, because it's got so watered down into just like completely ridiculous, psychotic actually stuff that's being called Tantra, which is, it's got repercussions.
so Duna and Hema, I mean, the harm reduction angle is really important. That I don't think the harm can happen if whether you are on a neo-tantra path, or on a classical tantra path, or on a Christianity or Buddhism, like that depends on the integrity of the teacher and the facilitators, and like what's that Tibetan Buddhist yeah. So that the point I was making was many different traditions have had teachers who take advantage of their students in different ways, and that is true for classical tantra as well. Just because somebody is teaching classical tantra does not mean they won't take advantage of you in some fashion, right? So I feel like the harm reduction piece is important, but that is just across all spiritual paths and being in a teacher role overall.
And actually, I'm just reflecting just real quick. I think that part of where I was coming from with that too, Hema, is actually a place of resignation when I really look at it, because the tradition that I come from is a Mahayoga tradition, which means like we work with awakened Kundalini energy. But I haven't been able to use the word Kundalini forever, because that word and that whole thing had been so co-opted that I just, from the Yogi Bhajan thing, that I just sort of gave up even trying to talk about it until I'm getting into a direct conversation. So I think that that's part of where that's coming from, honestly, is resignation. So I appreciate you pushing back about that definitions.
Sweet. So the next part I wanted to touch on is exactly how much sexuality even is in Tantra, because I found this interesting as well, that like, a lot of us find Neo-Tantra, and then there's this perception that like Tantra means sacred sex and that it's all sacred sexuality. And then you start going into classical Tantra, and depending which teacher you find, you'll find more or less reference to sexuality. So for example, I then went to Harish learning, was like kind of the first proper classical Tantra teacher. And, he, I know, kind of went a lot the other way, where he's like, I don't want to touch on the sexuality stuff. I'm not going to talk about it at all. And then I was like, oh, Tantra is not even about sex at all. But then actually I kept learning and got a bit more into some of the Tibetan Buddhist, Tibetan Tantra. And I've been reading this book, Passionate Enlightenment, which is about like female Buddhas, and there's a lot of sexuality. The Yogini Tantra is just full of like quite explicit erotic things around like yoni worship and the ways that men should please women and the way that they should go about sex. And it seems like every source that I read about Tantra will have very different things around how much sex was really involved in Tantra, if at all. Some people say it's just very strictly only these rituals, which would be very strict meditative practice. And then other ones are like, oh, they were fucking all the time. They were getting like kind of sharing cities, like superpowers through sex, and that was like a very active part of the practice. So, I hear some people saying like, oh, it's only 10% of Tantra, it's 20% of Tantra. Like, how much percentage Tantra? So I just thought, like, especially since there's a lot of sacred sexuality teachers that'll be watching this, what people want to say as far as like, what is the the link, and then how what would be a actually tantric expression of sexuality if you were going to define something as like, okay, this could be considered tantric sex and tantric sexuality, and this maybe not so much. So anyone feel like sharing on that?
Yeah, I can go on this. So I'll start with the analogy, like broccoli, cabbage, kale, mustard, Brussels sprouts are all of the same family, but based on what is emphasized emphasized, this the emphasis on the flower or the leaf, or it develops into a totally different vegetable, right? And so when we say, oh, is sexuality 10% of the tantra? I mean, most tantric paths don't have sexuality, right? That's the historic, but based on the history books that we have, most don't have sexuality, but some did have sexuality. They even had orgiastic meetings known as melapas, and this is something that I have learned from Harish, that he only talks about it in between, and he doesn't go into the depth because that's not his area of interest. So if we take this one lineage out of 100 that did have Nelapas or orgiastic meetings and stuff, and just like broccoli and kale look really different, that are part of the same family. Yeah, this orgiastic version looks really different than the aghoris who take death and being near death as the really important thing, and they focus on that. And so yeah, there is no sexuality in that lineage at all. So to try to calculate a percentage is really hard because of this aspect of it.
Yeah, I want to build on what Pratim said. There's no percentage calculation one can do. He brought up great examples, ones that I was going to bring up. I think the important thing is to realize that in Neo-Tantra, the end goal, which is articulated often, is great sex or ejaculatory retention, or whatever those techniques might be. And some of them are mishmash from Taoist Tantra. But the focus is on great sex. Whereas with Tantra as a spiritual path, the focus is on, and this is what Ben said before, enlightenment. Those are really the two things to keep in mind here. And there's some, I think Harshada said it, there's capitalism, there's patriarchy involved in when people talk about sex and sexuality. Again, it's interesting, as titillating. So it attracts folks. So that might be why there's more focus on publishing things like that. So that could be one of the reasons. But I would just say, yeah, we need to keep a focus on the fact that enlightenment is really what the spiritual path is all about. And sex is one of our strongest, most primordial force within our body. So it's only natural that tantrikas, people who followed tantric disciplines, would experiment in that place, in that area. But they would do so after having a long and strong foundation in other spiritual practices, clearing their energy channels so that they don't mix energy, and actually they don't affect each other's siddhis. They might take them on. And there's other things, like there's samskaras and all kinds of other things that you can take on from an energetic perspective. So they would do a lot of work to lay that foundation before exploring in sexuality. And I just think that there was a lot of taboo around expressing sexuality as well.
Yeah, and something that was said earlier, modern America or Berlin or even Mumbai for that matter is so different from medieval India, just in terms of like the life that people were leading when these scriptures were written, when these practices were there. That can't be said enough. And I think that's part of it. And also it's like the sexual practices that are in the tantras, they're oftentimes, I believe that practices really need to be given, and people need to be initiated into them. And especially those practices, like my Indian teacher friends that have tantric strains within their lineages, those practices are given to, like Hema was saying, after people had done so much cultivation And then they were almost always whispered teachings. In other words, just like given directly from the guru, not just a teacher, but like a guru to not just a student, but a disciple, like somebody who is like holding it in such an intense container. And then we have like sacred sexuality, conscious sexuality, which is amazing, the revival that is happening, I think, if we just can let it just be that. And, you know, I think that part of the harm reduction is taking some of the supernatural out of that and just letting that be beautiful and perfect just as it is, and not having to make it be something that is rooted in an ancient tradition, because it's like it's really hard to say that, you know. And let's make up some new stuff now that's really beautiful. We don't have to like get the legitimacy from the ancient thing, because we end up doing the opposite, I think, when we do that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I like, on the heels of that, I feel a part of me that also wants to acknowledge the sacred sexuality movement. And there's a part of me now that's like, oh my God, can we just let sex be sex? Like, we don't need to spiritualize it. And also, as a still recovering evangelical, I don't know that I could have healed like the sexual shame that was deeply planted in my body without it being spiritualized first. Like, because for so long God had said it's bad, I needed God to say it's good, so I could work through the process of getting all the way to the place where it's like, oh, it's just sex, and it's like just as sacred and holy as doing the dishes. And which is kind of like the real practice, and like something that you're both speaking to with like how initiates are deeply rooted in certain realizations before they start to play with that. Because I think one of the problems in the Neo-Tantra world is, as we've said, like bliss and ecstasy is held out as the goal, and then you get there and people are like, oh my God, I've done it, I'm awake. And I just want to be like, no, that's actually kind of like the starting point. Like you've successfully gotten to the beginning of the actual work, which is, whether it's through lovemaking, whether it's through some transcendent moment in ceremony where suddenly the veil drops and you have this embodied experience that's really deep and true. But without the proper foundation, then you're just like, oh, I need it again. Oh, I need it again. Oh, I need another one. I need more bliss. And instead of like, oh, the real work is, how do I allow that nectar to infuse every moment of life? And people aren't ever going to get there without the proper foundation and like the proper orientation of what is the actual goal here.
Yeah, like I said before, I think Neo-Tantra is a great gateway drug into spirituality and into classical Tantra. But, you know, you don't hear people saying biblic sex. You don't hear people saying that. You don't hear people saying Hasidic techniques for ejaculation. And you don't hear people saying toric ways to please your woman. I mean, and I would love to start doing that. In fact, I talk about this sometimes in my workshops. I want to come in and start quoting, you know, verses from the Bible while you all are having sex and see how that feels. You know, as a South Asian, the appropriation piece of it is very real. So yeah, I want to bring some awareness to that too. We want something that's ancient and spiritual, and it's okay to just take it from Hindu or Indian culture. Why is that? Why aren't we using other cultures to wrap around sexuality and spirituality, or sexuality? That's a question.
Yeah.
So Hema, I do have a response to that. As Harish would say, there are two aims of Tantra: Bodha, that is awakening, and Bhoga, that is the worldly enjoyment, right? And most other spiritual thoughts, they only have Bodha. They only have their aim on awakening, and they dismiss Bhoga. So Tantra is one of the rare spiritual thoughts that legitimizes both aims, though Bodha is higher, is held is held higher, and so we have to focus on awakening, and then also focus on enjoying the worldly life. That when teachers like Harish, they teach and I asked him like, hey, I have read all your books, I have read all your techniques. Then all of them are bodha techniques. They are all techniques of awakening. Do you teach any yoga techniques at all? And he was like, no, he doesn't teach any yoga techniques. But yoga techniques did exist. Tantra has many different ways of enhancing how you enjoy life, either by acquiring powers or like many different ways. But he doesn't teach any of them. And
I'd argue
so
that he does with some of the sensual practices, like in the Vijnana Bhattava Tantra, for example, there are bliss practices, there are sensual practices, which I guess, you could say is for liberation, or you could say is for, worshiping the goddess through your body. So it's like, he might not admit it, but there definitely are some in there.
Okay,
And there are some
good.
quotes.
Good that you
There are
found
some
them.
quotes from Abhinavagupta that are in various texts that talk very explicitly about sexual practices, some that even cause me to raise my eyebrow. So yeah, it does exist.
Yeah.
Okay, I would love to hear them then.
I wanted to just echo something that Ben said that I think is really good for me to like be reminded of. And it is that, a lot of us come from really puritanical backgrounds, and, evangelical Christianity. I came from a very puritanical yoga background. I came from, an Indian kind of yoga context where, I practiced brahmacharya throughout my 20s, and I had a lot of unpacking of that stuff to do. And definitely there was some work to allow the sexuality to be sacred, still to this day. So I think that that's also like a really important piece to like highlight, that that's an important positive thing about the Neo-Tantra or sacred sexuality, is just that, is like being able to bring God into the bedroom and bring God into the orgasmic experience and arousal. It's very healing.
Yes.
Yeah, and
So,
if I can jump in on the
just
back of that.
very quick, because we're almost out of
Yes.
time. Yeah.
Yeah. So hold on. Yeah, so that's kind of where I ended up coming full circle from being like such a purist, is there's this facet of Tantra that, and to put it briefly, it really is about turning towards anything that is still unresolved and undigested. And I kept being like, oh, it's not about sex, it's not about sex, it's not about sex. And then like getting into the field and working a lot more with people, and I'm like, oh, well, where does almost everybody still have deeply unresolved, undigested, samskaras? And it's like universally sex, at least in the puritanical West. Like the wound runs so deep that nobody's not cut. And so there's this part of me that's like, okay, it's not. And also there's so much to heal and reclaim in that space that greatly aids someone in following the true path. And also I'm just like unapologetically on team, like, let's all have great sex. That's like 100% on that team, even if it isn't Tantra. So
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think also like part of the reason why sex was included in a lot of these lineages, because it's one of the most powerful drivers of our life force. It's one of the biggest distractions. Like fear of death and impulse to want to fucking procreate and connect are like two of the biggest unconscious drives, sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious. And if we don't work with that energy and we don't learn how to harness it in the right way, then it just wreaks havoc on our life. And so that's kind of the whole point, is like, how do we get that energy in check and come into integrity with it, come into right relationship with that energy, so that then we can use that aliveness for having the best life, becoming liberated and light and whatever, rather than spending all of our time fucking around and having really terrible relationships and getting more traumatized through our sexuality. So, all very important. So we're at the hour mark. I know, yeah, Tris is commenting, and I agree that, like, wow, there's so much we could talk about, and could talk about this for many, many hours. So maybe we're going to need to have a round two at some point. But I just want to bring it back to, speaking to those of us in the Neo-Tantra scene around, what, just something around like kind of integrity and humility, I feel like came through a lot here, like the humility of being like, this is a huge tradition that like has thousands of years. There's so many different lineages, so many different approaches. So, an awareness around like, I am Tantra, and this is Tantra, and this is what it's like, is just kind of, I think for most people, going to be in the wrong direction. So like, how do we have some humility around like what a big thing we're representing when we use this word? And then, like integrity around being aware that, yes, marketing, capitalism, we need to feed our faces, and we're trying to be successful in our work, but then recognizing the repercussions of, like, if we didn't get to touch on this so much, but the word Tantra, I have to censor it now if I'm typing on Instagram, because now it's become a censored word. And it's like, oh my God, imagine if like Christianity became censored, or Buddhist, writing Buddha is censored. Like, that's a big thing for a lot of us. This is our spiritual path. And this is, if you look up the Tantra hashtag, then it's a bunch of softcore porn a lot of the time coming up. And we need to be aware that like that has repercussions on many people in many cultures. And, that we need to be aware of our actions around that, and be, have some humility. And I also just had some little notes of like some of the things I've been seeing here, like people offering like a tantric initiation, meaning like, oh, intro to Tantra workshop. But when you call it tantric initiation, that means something very different to Tantras. And calling yourself a tantric priestess, it's like, would you call yourself a Buddhist lama after going to a couple of workshops in Buddhism? Like, I mean, it's one thing, oh, I'm embodying the archetype and I like Tantra, but like calling yourself a tantric priestess, I mean, you need to learn what that actually means, that you are wedded to a temple and taking care of a deity every day for the rest of your life. Like, that's what being a tantric priestess actually means. And people are throwing these words around that, has repercussions. So, there's so much we can talk about this subject, but I'd just love a final round for each of us, just around what do you think is important for those watching, those of us using the word Tantra, going into this Neo-Tantra world. Like, what do you want to just give a little note or a little something around just what we should be considering? And any final words to people? So maybe we just go in order. Hema, if you want to start, and then
thank you. That was a great summary of our conversation, and I agree, we need a round two, maybe even a round three. This is what I would say. I would say that there is much more to Tantra than good sex, than Neo-Tantra, but good sex is a great way to understand more about spirituality. And really, Tantra is about the deconstruction of ego and the deprogramming of what society has told you. So that, I'm going to leave it at that. Just deconstruct your ego, and the rest will fall into place.
I will say that if you take just one thing, just having the intention of recognizing the divine in ourselves and everything else, and then doing anything that you do with that intention, it for me, it makes it the tantric.
Then
I will say three things in closing. The first is always get as close as you can to the authentic root of what you're studying, practicing, and teaching. The second is always try to be as clear and informative as you can about where anything comes from. And the third thing is, which is more of a sales pitch for the classical path or the deeper work, is that having had boatloads of extraordinary sex and bliss, I will say that it doesn't even come close to what's really accessible to you through the deeper journey of the sadhana.
And Harshada.
Boy, everyone has said everything. I would just say that, hurt people, free people, free people. And ultimately, I think that we can be here to help make this world a better place, first through uplifting ourselves and freeing ourselves, and then creating a world around us. Bob Thurman one time defined Tantra for me, just in a conversation, as weaving a world of wisdom. And, having established ourselves in that wisdom, then creating a world that frees others. And also we get to enjoy it. The vision is on our deathbed, high-fiving the grandkids, having really completely done it, and hopefully help some people along the way.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, so juicy topic. Thank you everyone for putting in your perspectives. I hope that this serves those watching it. I know it kind of opens up more questions, and that's part of the point. And yeah, I think on the thread we can, have some discussion underneath the replay. If you've got questions, if you want to tag any of us and ask something about what we shared, then would love to continue this discussion. And yeah, so with evolving Eros as well, like, I'm even thinking now, instead of multiple of these, like we're creating like short online courses that are kind of additional learning for facilitators, like trauma awareness, like inclusivity. We want to do some on like spiritual activism. And I'm feeling like, yeah, there needs to be one that's just around like Tantra, and like maybe I can even get all of us back just to teach a little module on that, and we can create a whole short course around it, because yeah, I think this is just such a big subject, and I'd really love if the whole Tantra scene could just realign a little bit, because there's so much beauty and wisdom and magic happening in this scene, so much liberation and pleasure and joy and beauty and community. And if the teachers, if we could all do that work to just realign a little bit and bring more liberation focus and into our work, and really help people find a pathway to enlightenment through the juicy play and celebration, then the world would be a much more epic place. So thanks for those that joined live. Thank you for all of you watching the replay as well. And I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you.
Almost everybody.
More drama, more Rama, less drama, less trauma. All right. More krama. Yes.
Now we're talking.
Yes. All right. Thanks, everyone. Much love.
Thanks, Luna. Thanks, everyone.